All right, Don, so here we go. 6.4, the War for 1812, War of 1812. Our lesson objective here is to understand the causes and effects of the War of 1812. Right? This is really an important event in American history. It's been called the Second War for Independence. It's kind of, we have a lot of folklore about it, especially living in Baltimore with Fort McHenry and Star Spangled Banner. There's still a lot of different parts of this war. Our essential question here is, how is this war going to promote nationalism? Right? We've been talking about the idea of nationalism and sectionalism kind of facing off with each other this entire time period. I think this war, the War of 1812, is going to be a big moment for nationalism.
And one thing you really want to focus on when thinking about nationalism is the fact that nationalism is putting the interest of the whole nation or country ahead of sectional or regional interests. So when we say, how does this war promote nationalism, we're really saying, how does the War of 1812 make America come together and promote this idea of American spirit and moving the whole country forward as well? So one thing we'd like to do is give you a little bit of background prior to the War of 1812. As you know, Thomas Jefferson wins the elections of 1800 to 1804. Following that, Jefferson's Secretary of State, James Madison, then wins the elections of 1808 and 1812. So this war happens in the middle of Madison's presidency. But these issues begin as early as Jefferson's second term. We've discussed how Jefferson's first term was a huge success for a lot of different reasons, but his second term, not so much. The legacy of Jefferson is a great one, but he certainly had his hiccups along the way. In Jefferson's second term, the end of Jefferson's second term in 1807, there were a lot of grievances against Britain. And over time, Britain has shown a disrespect for the United States of America. They do not recognize us as a world power in the way they act towards us. And it was no more evident than when they started basically capturing our ships and impressing our sailors. They were basically claiming that our sailors were British citizens going back, a generation, and that they should be fighting or serving the king. Even when American sailors would show their citizenship papers, oftentimes they weren't recognized by the British. And so those American sailors were more or less kidnapped. We've talked about the failure of Jay's Treaty back during Adams' presidency and the British exerting their leverage, and here they are trying to exert their leverage once again. Well, Jefferson didn't know what to do. He stripped down our army and our navy, so we were not a powerful country. We were not really a country prepared for war. But Jefferson didn't know what else to do. So he figured, I'll use the only leverage I have. I will hit them where it hurts, in their wallet. They used the United States for a huge amount of trade. Britain was currently at war with France, which is one of the reasons why they were impressing many of our sailors, thinking we were trading with France or the Dutch or someone else.
The French and whoever it was. To be fair, the British, about half of our sailors were actually British citizens.
Yeah, they were British citizens. So what they would do is they would pull our ships over under the assumption that they were only going to then take the British sailors off the American ships, but oftentimes is they would basically commandeer the ship, take the British sailors, and then also take American sailors. Or they were British citizens who had gained American citizenship, had the proof of it, and the British refused to recognize it. So there's a little more that goes into it. But either way, the British were messing with us on the high seas, and Jefferson decides that he is going to pass an embargo on Britain, basically saying that Britain can no longer trade with the United States of America, trying to use the only leverage we have over them, and that is money. Now, this doesn't work out very well, which we'll talk about more on the next slide, but that was the last big thing Jefferson did, and that will lead towards a war with Britain.
Yeah, on the same time, the Native Americans are still in the West. Native American settlers are moving into the Northwest Territory, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Right, it's great land. People want to live out there. But the only problem is that is people already live there. What we have is in Congress, we have a group of congressmen called the Warhawks, led by Kentucky Congressman, Speaker of the House Henry Clay, and South Carolina Congressman John C. Calhoun. They're both very young, they're both very ambitious, and they both want to kick the Native Americans out of the Western lands and move white settlers into the area. Okay? There's a couple major defeats for the American armies out in this territory. Most of the fighting here happens in Indiana. William Henry Harrison, who's an American general, finally is able to win a battle at Tippecanoe where they forces Native Americans, basically under the brother of Tecumseh, who we'll get to Tecumseh a little bit more later, who is a native chief of the Shawnee who's been fighting the Americans the entire time. He defeats his forces at Tippecanoe even though Tecumseh wasn't there, and they find that the natives were using all British weapons supplied through Canada. So you can see that the British have been in our Western territory giving weapons, giving money, giving supplies to the natives so they could fight American settlers.
And this becomes a real sticking point for the Americans. Following the Revolutionary War, and especially following Jay's Treaty, the understanding was that the British would leave the Northwest Territory. The Northwest Territory, as we've spoken about before, is America's land. We won it fair and square in the Revolutionary War. So the fact that the British still have forts in this area, and now we come to find that they are most likely, we didn't have absolute proof, but it was almost undeniable, that they are most likely providing Native Americans with weapons to fight us. To Clay and Calhoun and other war hawks in Congress, that alone was an act of war. If you give our enemies weapons that will help them kill us, you are basically indirectly declaring war on the United States.
So by 1810, 1809, these congressmen are really starting to call for war with Britain. And it's going to take a while to move that way. But the rumblings of war are there from basically Jefferson Barlow.
Yeah, and so next we're going to look at the Declaration of War. As I mentioned, James Madison will become president in 1808, and it will last 8 years through 1816. And when James Madison becomes president, Jefferson's embargo runs out, but then James Madison passes the Non-Intercourse Act, which is basically the same thing, opening up American trade not to Britain or France, which certainly isn't going to be much of a help. Now, at this time, you have some pretty overwhelming sectionalism in the United States. The political parties are clearly split, but what we're seeing is that behind the popularity of Jefferson and Madison, the Federalist Party is dying, and they're dying very quickly. The War of 1812 and the Embargo and Non-Intercourse Act prior to the war infuriated Federalist politicians, because if you remember, most Federalists were in the Northeast. The Northeast is a huge merchant area. Having an embargo on Britain, France, and other countries, and then a second act saying that you have an embargo on Britain and France, is going to kill their merchant trade. And so their business is suffering, their livelihood is suffering. So many Federalists infamously meet during the War of 1812 in Hartford, Connecticut, at what is known as the Hartford Convention. They're protesting the War of 1812, and they're even, you even hear rumblings of secession from these New Englanders who want to break away from America so they can trade with Britain again, so they can get back to where they were prior to the embargo. The Hartford Convention will turn out very horribly for those involved, because by the time the War of 1812 ends, in 1816, the United States of America feels like they scored a huge victory over Britain. And all of these men involved in the Hartford Convention are going to look like traitors to the American cause and sunshine patriots. And when things aren't going their way, they just want to break away and run away. This is important primarily because this truly is the end of the Federalist Party in the United States of America. And the United States of America for the next about 12-ish years will be a country of one party, and that's the Republicans.
Right. So Americans have always kind of had this belief that Canada wanted to be part of America. I'm not really sure why we ever wanted to incorporate Canada into our country, but for some reason a lot of them really wanted to. So we invade, when war is declared or we move to war with Britain, the most obvious target is Canada. So we move in, we score some quick victories early, we end up defeating keeping the remnants of Tecumseh's forces. In Canada, we destroyed York, which is today Toronto. We burned it to the ground. But we win a few battles on the Great Lakes. But the British Navy kind of shows up a year later. They're able to kind of hold off our advances in Canada. We're never able to solidify our support in Canada. Most Canadians want nothing to do with being Americans, which we always had a really hard time understanding. So the war stalemates in Canada. And some people, when you're looking at the end and you look at what nation benefited the most from the War of 1812, you could probably make the argument that Canada was the one that really came out on top.
And one thing to keep in mind is early in the War of 1812, when the United States of America is scoring these victories, Britain is busy fighting France. So Britain does not have the money, the manpower, or the time to spend on the United States of America. This war is more of a burden and an obnoxious event to them more than anything else. But in the year 1814, Britain is done with France. They've won the war with France, and now they can focus all of their energies on the United States, and that they did. Famously, the British Army landed in the Chesapeake. It marched towards Washington, D.C. at an unstoppable rate. The United States of America knew they were not prepared. You have to remember, the U.S. Navy and Army is still quite small from Jefferson's naval and army cuts. So they're a very weak fighting force. Britain marches on Washington, D.C., and in order to avenge the burning down of Toronto, they burn down much of D.C., famously burning down the White House. And it will end up charring and destroying about 2/3 of the White House, which will have to totally be rebuilt. James Madison has to leave the White House, and he has to govern from Philadelphia, I believe, for a while. And after the British have taken D.C., now we're going to march on Baltimore. And famously, the British Army marches across Patterson Park, where Patterson Park is today, and North Point. There's a battle of North Point, and the Continental Army is able to barely hold off the British land forces. But that wasn't the real fear. The real fear was the British Navy, who was coming for the Baltimore Harbor. Now, because of certain blockades the Americans put up in the harbor, the British have to fire on the Baltimore Harbor from quite far away. They fire on Fort McHenry all day and all night. Famously, Fort McHenry survives that attack. Francis Scott Key is a man who's negotiating a prisoner release aboard a British ship outside of Baltimore when he awakens the next morning to see the American flag still hanging over Fort McHenry, which of course is what motivated him to write the Star-Spangled Banner today. By keeping the British out of Baltimore, the Continental, or I should say the American Army and Navy, have thwarted a huge threat to the United States of America. Because Britain was not able to succeed here, along with some other minor factors, Britain decides that it's time to start talking peace. They don't have the patience or the money to keep fighting this war. They realize it's a war that's not worth it. But while America and Britain are negotiating peace in Belgium, in Ghent, Belgium, Andrew Jackson and the American Army meet a British force at the Battle of New Orleans. Now, the interesting thing here is the Battle of New Orleans was actually fought after the peace treaty was signed, but that didn't matter. The Battle of New Orleans was a crushing defeat for the British, a sweeping victory for the United States, in which Jackson's men killed a few thousand and only lost a few dozen. This will catapult General Andrew Jackson into American fame. But what's interesting is while the Treaty of Ghent was signed before the battle, word of the treaty had not reached the United States by the time Jackson won the battle. So word gets around to the U.S. that Jackson wins this huge battle over the British, and then a couple days later, word comes that the British had signed a treaty. And all of a sudden, it looks like General Andrew Jackson is the one primarily responsible for winning the War of 1812.
And it's important to remember the treaty is status quo pre-war. There's no concessions made, right? The British had they actually stopped impressing troops at the time the war had even started. Right? So the war was kind of, by the end of it, there's no new territories gained, there's no nothing, but for the United States, you have this, it's confidence, right? We beat Britain again, we kind of step out under the shadow of the British Empire, and that's what's really important about this war.
Yeah, I mean, Britain in the treaty, again, Britain basically said, fine. After all these years, after 39 years, 40 years, you can have the United States of America. They clearly defined the border between the US and Canada, and Britain said, fine, we will be gone, we will be done with it. For America, that's a huge deal, because now they're unshackled by Europe. They're not being weighed down by Europe. As Mr. Manelsky said, they can step out of Britain's shadow and really have the confidence moving forward that they will be their own independent nation, and a powerful and successful one at that.
Anything else to come up?
No, I think we're good.
All right, thanks for watching. If you have any questions about any of this stuff, make sure you ask your history teacher. And stay tuned for the next episode of your history.